Now comes my personal favorite part of creating a virtual practical. How do we capture and how do we produce media to integrate it into our tool? That's what's coming up next. As a science creator, I truly believe in the power of visual materials. So, in this video, we will take a look at how you can create all those pieces of content, everything that you need, with just a smartphone, maybe your computer. We'll see it's something that every teacher can do by themselves or maybe in a team, sometimes with a little help of a professional.
So yeah, when we started thinking about how to capture the visuals and how to do the footage, um, I think here in Maastricht we were a bit lucky because one of the partners in the RALDE project was Tom Jansen. He has his own business of making video material both from YouTube but also about science communication. So for me, it was an easy go-to. So bottom line, you could go to an expert to ask, can you please come and film? But it's not as easy as that because you really need to think about also what do you need to prepare before that expert comes to our lab. And for instance, in our case with the cell cultures, of course, we had to make sure the cell cultures were ready in the right passages. And for instance, that was something we wanted to visualize. We also wanted to visualize like what if cells have been cultured for too long, so the different colors of the medium. So you have to think about everything, also the lab space itself. So we had to yeah, think ahead. Okay, what do we want to be captured and prepare for that. We also captured some of the things ourselves with our cell phones. Just for instance, in order to give a real life picture, imagining the student looking to a microscope, seeing their cells in the microscope. Of course, you can have these cameras on top of the microscopes to take beautiful pictures, but in the end, we ended up with taking our smartphones and going over the ocular to actually capture the pictures of the cell cultures, because that's also how the students see it when they would look through a microscope. So it was a bit of like, okay, you can make beautiful pictures from a camera, but how would the students experience it in real life? And then, yeah, other simple pictures. We asked advice, for instance, yeah, taking pictures of which type of spray bottle should you use for ethanol and for cleaning surfaces, or which types of boxes should you use for freezing the cells. We asked for advice. Okay, what is a good background? How should the lighting be? How should the orientation be? So these kind of pictures you can also take yourself with a cell phone. But for instance, the 360-degree picture is more tricky. So there we, of course, went for expert help.
To get this media literacy uh, is more a barrier that we have in our mind that doesn't allow us sometimes to try. In fact, it's not so difficult when you start trying, but the problem is that we are focused on our day to day. We are overloaded with work, and we think that this will take too much time, that will stop our work, and you don't start. With some advices that you gave us, I think we could take very good pictures with our smartphones. It's an open rat. It's not beautiful anyway in many cases, but we are showing the organs correctly to our students. That's what I wanted. And now I am also happy because I know that if I want to take something new or to include something new, I have the tools. I don't need anything else. And it won't block my work just because I just can do it in the same way I did it.
So as the two ladies just said, it wasn't that easy always to get all the knowledge across. I've been doing film, I've been doing video as a science communicator for quite a while now, but it's something that not is not very common in the scientific community. So for me, it was really important that we actually had the possibility of just using our phones to record all of this, because it's something that's very accessible. It's something that has high quality, especially nowadays if you're using an iPhone or any other similar brand in a quite okay price range. It should be having quite okay video, should be capable of taking pictures. And if we're using this for online tools for web, also we have to look at the file size, that it's not too big. So how we did this here was that we have a few recording sessions in Maastricht, so at the University of Maastricht, which is a little bit closer for me. So it was actually possible to travel there, to try and get a few of those shots, play around with the format, playing around with the topics first and foremost, figuring out, okay, how do we capture this in a neat way, in a clear way, something that is actually usable and understandable by an audience. And then from there, I advised Ariane to do the same thing as I did, but then on a more personal level. So I think the key message here is just having somebody, if you're doing this yourself, is having somebody in a team who has been doing video a little bit before, or at least getting somebody on maybe a consultant basis, or somebody you can ask to, an expert who can help you develop the placements of the shots. But that's something we'll come back to in a bit. So yeah, I think if this is something that somebody without any prior back knowledge in video or photo should follow, I think it's really good to first understand what the whole production process is of capturing media. So when it comes down to that, it splits up into three separate workflows. First of all, we have pre-production. This is where you're going to write everything down, ideate about, okay, how are we going to put this, what is the right lab space. You're going to do a little bit of a location scout. This can be very easy if you have access to the lab, of course, but you're going to look at the place, see, okay, what would be some really good angles I can play with. Are there some specific work spots that I can mount some gear? Where am I going to do this? That's first and for all. Then a little bit of a script, of at least an outline of what you're going to be doing. So that means, okay, today we need to get this and this and this and this and this shot. Just knowing and really understanding beforehand what kind of a shot list is that you need. Do I need to take pictures of just the lab? Do I need to take pictures more close-ups of specific materials, gear that we're using in the lab? Or for example, do I need a microscope image to use all of this afterwards? So that's the pre-production phase, the ideation phase, and the scripting phase. Then we come to the actual production, of course. This is where we're going to use our gear to capture the media. And for that, I would say, and that's why like I said, we're really relying on the phone, because normally when you have a phone, you are quite capable of capturing something that looks pretty good. Like this thing has a lot of they call it computational filmmaking and photography. So it will make sure that a lot of those manual settings on high end cameras, you don't have to think about that. Now, what I do want to mention first and for all, you're gonna but always have a camera up front, but also a camera in the back. This is your main camera. So I would just always advise use the main camera first. This is going to give you the best image possible in any way. Also, know if you're going to film in vertical or take pictures in vertical mode or in horizontal. This is one of the biggest mistakes that I've come across working with other scientists, because we're so used to now film like this. Sometimes, especially if you're using an online tool, this video will end up on YouTube or someplace to host. Well, this is actually the way to film, rather this one. So this could work, but if you have this, it's going to be very difficult to scale that image into a horizontal frame. So framing, like I said, is really important, but also knowing what to take images from or take the video from. So working from that shot list that you created in the pre-production phase, then comes the really important part of capturing those visuals. And what I would say is, don't always take your perspective. So what I mean with your perspective, if you're just going and pointing towards something, this would be the way to do it. And it's just from your eye level perspective. And I would suggest really looking at the object or the setting that you need to record. What is the best possible angle from that? So for example, when you're filming gloves, that's something very particular, not something very is important, but I mean, we can get that image across pretty easily. So for that, just a top down shot where you're having the object laying on the bottom and you take an image just from above will give you a really nice perception and a really nice perspective. Whereas if you're working with, for example, an incubator, or for example, the water bath, something that you really need to see the whole thing in, is actually good to use different kind of angles to capture the whole image afterwards. What I mean by that is take one, but at the level of the object that you're taking. So, for example, if this is your water bath, take it at the same level. Don't use the eye level thing we talked about before. Use it a little bit more down. Then what else you can do is just get a little bit of coverage, as we call it. Take images and take videos from multiple sides, maybe a little bit up top, maybe a little bit from a wider angle, something that's more close. So you don't have to go back afterwards. You don't have to. That's the worst thing to do. Is you get all the shots, you get all the images, all the material, you're working it in the edit, and then you found out, oh, I actually forgot something very easy you could have done while you were recording it. So I think once we have a good idea of everything that we needed to have shots from, also the gear that you're using, so I think once we have all of that covered, we got all of our imagery, then we go to the third part, which is the post-production phase. This is where you're going to cut up all the different shots. You're going to make sure that you only use the specific parts that you really need. You're going to make it into a video, maybe edit it into some pictures that can be used in the tool. But that's something we're going to be talking about a little bit after. Yes. So when we're talking about all the gear that you're going to be using, of course, we have our camera. In our case, we went for the smartphone, but of course, that's not the only camera that you can use. There are other higher end cameras if you have that availability. Sometimes when you're at a university, you actually have access to teams, video teams that might help you in this whole setting. If you don't have that access, maybe you have, for example, a DSLR laying around or a mirrorless camera. That's the one with the interchangeable lenses. If you know how to use that, that's also a really, really great possibility. But there's this other small camera that's actually very useful to be used. It's the action camera. So it could be a GoPro or any other brand that makes something like an action camera. And now, why these are really, really useful is because they have a quite wide, wide view, so a wide field of view, meaning that you will capture quite a lot of information in your lab space or the workbench that you're working on. You can always afterwards in the edit punch in a little bit. And with what I mean with that is you can focus in on some particular parts by just zooming in a little bit. An action cam is actually really something useful. And also you can mount these things in a very unusual way. For example, what we did in the workbench, we had to take a shot from somebody working with his hands and figuring out what's the best place to put your hands while you're working. Now, this is very difficult to get a really good shot from because we have the air vents, we have everything. This whole thing is covered, the workspace. So, how do we capture that? I took some duct tape. I had a mount, which is normally used for putting your GoPro on a cap. I mounted those things together with the GoPro on top, and we had an actual possible mount to capture something that otherwise would be very difficult to get, especially if you're just standing, trying to stand still, and somebody else is hovering on top of you. That's not the way to go. So I would say invest in some actual good gear besides the camera, meaning some mounting options. It could be really simple things as small tripods, things you can put up on a bench, things you can put up in the lab. So, a tripod to put your camera on. And especially if you're going to be using audio, I would invest in a good microphone because 50% of a good video is the audio. If the video quality is a little bit degraded, that's not the biggest issue. But when the audio is very annoying and it makes a lot of weird sounds, that's when people really turn off their engagement, and it's something you cannot really filter out. So if you have the camera, you have a mounting option and a microphone to top it all off, I think you have a very solid foundation to just get started. And otherwise, you can look at the lists in the description box below with some other tidbits that we feel like is important, you can use for recording videos. So when we're thinking about recording in the lab specifically, I found that there are a couple of different angles that are actually very needed to tell the story or get everything across. First of all, that could be the wide angle. So getting just a really good image of what does the lab look like. Can be an image, can be a video, but it's something that I think is very interesting because it allows the user, the viewer of the materials afterwards to really see what is the space that we're going to be working on, especially if it's an online practical. Yeah, it helps you show, okay, these are the spots, the workbenches, and the different gear that you're going to be using for your experiments. So that's a very important shot. So something that I think is going to be really interesting to practice, from the perspective of a teacher, but also from the student side, is getting good imagery from a microscope. And it's something that's really simple to do, but it does take some practice to get a really good alignment with the microscope and your phone. But if you can align it in a way that the light that's coming out of the ocular directly hits one of the lenses, specifically your main lens, if you have multiple cameras like this system, if you can make sure that it directly aligns, you're going to have a really, really nice view from what's happening inside of the microscope. This is something that's very useful because with the quality that these things have nowadays, it's most of the time it's better than those aftermarket things you can put on top of the microscope. So this doesn't really matter if you're just about any type of microscope that you're using, as long as it's using light as a source, you can capture it with a smartphone. The last thing that I want to say here is close-ups. It's very funny, but as a filmmaker or as a content creator, you have the instinct of making sure that everything looks cinematic. However, I think it comes down to more of a functional capturing process. What I mean with that is sometimes we need to take the best possible picture, but the best possible picture isn't the nicest looking. If you want to show a process, if you want to show something that's happening, that needs to be the subject of your image. So if something is happening in front of you, always find out and play around with it to find what's the best possible angle to show the handling that we're using at this moment. So for example, if you're pipetting and you're putting something in test tubes, or you're working really with your hands quite a lot, easier thing to do might be to go to a normal lab and a normal workbench. And most of the time these are split like next to each other. So you have one workbench, you have the middle section, which is just where all the electricity is, and you have another workbench. But there usually is a quite open room in between, and you can set up on the other side and film through that hole, so you have an actual full image of what that person is doing. Again, practice makes perfect. So the more that you're going to record this, the more you're going to see, okay, this is something that is very needed. It's not what you think looks the nicest. It's not what you feel will be the prettiest kind of image you can make. No, I think it's really important to think what will teach the students in the best way possible. And if you hold that thought, you will come up with something that's actually worth putting in an online practical. Okay, so besides the video aspect or the photo aspect of having a camera and the gear to actually capture something, one other thing that is really important is of course having good lighting. As you can see now, I have you don't see this, but I have one, two, three, four different lights plus this one in the back, all to make this image possible. And I'm going to tell you straight from the getaway, if you haven't done lighting as a video, in the theme of video or photo, is going to be really hard to find the placing in the first place. But again, it's something that comes with practice. So, what I would suggest, if you're lighting a subject, if you're lighting a person that needs to explain something, always try to get at least one good light source and use it at a 45-degree angle. So, this way, you're going to have nice and soft lighting, bring it as close as possible without being too harsh. But this will give you a nice lighting for a person. If you're going to be using this in a lab setting, maybe for example, if you're doing a dissection, make sure that there's actually good lighting of the objects that you're working on. So in this case, it's nice to have two different lamps, one at a 45-degree angle from this side, one on the other side, similar 45 degrees angle. And this will give you a lighting where you don't have that much shadows come onto your subject. The main thing is either the light is going to be too harsh, so you need to make it a little bit softer. You can use that with some diffusion material. Could be some paper, could be a cloth or anything. Next thing could be is the angle of the light that's not fit for what you're trying to film. If this is your camera and you're going to be lighting like this, you're going to have a very, very black shadow right here. If this is your camera and you're filming like this, that could be a really good one. But if you're having, for example, reflective surfaces, so I'm thinking about flasks or maybe a solution that you're working in, you're going to have a straight reflection of a camera. That's also not what you want, or maybe the light source itself. So always think of adding an extra few lights if possible, and try not always to use the lights at a ceiling, because ceiling lights tend to have very different frame rates. So the flickering might happen because the camera sensor is recording in a different speed than the light is emitting at a different wavelength. So there can be some flickering happening in the image. It's not something you would want. Yeah, in any case, I think if you just think about how to light a subject the right way, there are always going to be materials for you available. Every lab has some lamps available. Especially in a lab, it's very white light, it's very good light to film something. So even if it just means getting an extra light just to boost a little bit of what's happening, that could already go a very long way in recording something. When it comes to editing, there are actually two ways you can go with this. First of all, if you are a professional, you're going to have professional gear to edit with. So I'm using for pictures and images, I'm using Adobe Lightroom, which allows me to dial in a specific style and play around with the values of, for example, the temperature of the room, but also the tint of the image. And that allows me to just highlight certain things a little bit more. When it comes to video, I'm using Adobe Premiere. Again, this is a professional software. You might have access to this, but sometimes you don't have access through the university, and it's a paid software. But it is going to give you really good possibilities in having the freedom to create however you want to. This is true if you're using the Adobe suite. It is also true if you're using DaVinci Resolve, some other tools that are paid. However, if you are not very used to these professional suites, as we call them, I think doing everything on your phone is one of the best ways to do this. And I've been looking up, and actually, there's some really useful video editors nowadays on these phones. But you can also, for example, do this on a tablet. The ones that I suggest are InShot, a video editing software I've been using myself. CapCut, very easy to use. Sometimes even has templates. Depending on what you're doing, you can use that for. You have Splice and VN Video Editor. All of these have a free version. They also have a pro version, which is paid. You can do quite a lot in these free versions from the get-go. When it comes to editing everything together in a video aspect, make sure you cut clips when they need to be cut. Don't put them too long if there's nothing valuable in the frame. If nothing's really happening, like those parts, you can trim them closer and closer until you only have what's actually useful. So you can use multiple clips after each other until you create a kind of sequence that tells the story that you want to tell here. When it comes to pictures, like I said before, I started off with this, but make sure that all pictures are within a little bit of the same style. So that means you're just taking all the images in your editor. Maybe you can create a preset for yourself where you just dial in the temperature and the tint of the frame, maybe add or maybe play around with the contrast, the lighting, all of those different settings, and then copy paste them onto the other ones. Maybe tweak them a little bit if needed, but just so you have the same style of image. There's nothing worse when you're working in one of these protocols or one of these online tools specifically, and everything you're seeing looks different than the other one before, and you're thinking like this comes across as from something very unprofessional. Also, what helps in the editing part is if you take an image and it's a little bit slanted or it's not very straight at the moment, you can just crop in a little bit and make sure that everything looks the way that it's supposed to look. If you have a little bit of knowledge, like Photoshop or some similar retouching software, you can also clean up the image and make sure that, for example, in the lab can be very busy spaces. You can clean some of those parts out so the full focus is on the object that you're looking at. Something that I think is very underestimated when it comes to imagery or just taking videos is the amount of time that it takes to capture all of these materials. You're going to have to play with the setup, making sure you get everything set up the right way, finding the different angles, and then you're going to have to capture everything. But you also capture something from multiple angles, so multiple times. You're going to have to repeat a few things. And after that, you have to review just to make sure you get everything. So it's not just we're going inside of the lab, we're filming something, and this is going to be taking 1 hour or maybe 2 hours. No, I would make sure that if you're going to do this, do it properly. At least take a half a day of a time block of half a day so you can actually capture everything and set up everything the right way. If you have the possibility, just take out a full day to just capture these materials, because that's something that maybe we don't always understand in the moment, but in a moment it can feel like we it's going to take so much time that we don't have to capture all of this. Wherever it's going to give you a lot of more free time in the future because you don't always have to do this again and again and again in class. So by just taking the time to do it well the first time, you're not going to have to come back and again to make sure that everything is done the right way. And for that, I talked about this in the beginning, but it's the pre-production phase, planning and just making sure you thought of everything. If you do that well, you're not going to spend a lot of time in the lab capturing everything, but you're also not going to spend a lot of time editing because you know what you want from the get-go. I think if that is something that teachers can work on a little bit more, it will be very easy to put a lot of practicals into a photo and video format. So, if you're doing something like this and you want to have an actual team you're working with, I think the best ways to do this is always have a professional at the handy. I really found that having just a filmmaker or just a photographer isn't always the perfect fit because they might lack some scientific knowledge. So in this case, I think it's really good to look at a science communicator, somebody who is knowledgeable when it comes to video and photo, who have mastered the creative art of taking those two mediums and dealing with it. So that's one side, and of course, on the other side, you need the actual teacher, the the experts in what you're trying to capture. So I think if you can combine the two, that's the perfect workaround because also the expert can then be the model that is in the video or in the photo. If you're doing this just by yourself, it's going to be very very difficult. However, if you don't have an expert ready, I would still advocate for having two people at minimum of working on this, just so you have again that model, somebody who can be in the frame and who can help you with thinking about different shots, but also it helps you have a little bit more momentum during the day of the shoot. You don't have to do something, then stop what you're doing, go back to the camera, look if everything is okay, and then set it up for a different shot, start recording, walk over, do your things. Doing everything yourself just takes a lot of time. So if you have someone available that can help you take some behind the scenes, for example, you can also use it for other materials afterwards. So I think most of the scientists who feel a little bit afraid of doing all of this, I would just suggest just give it a try first, and then just as Ariane said, it's something that everyone can do. You just have to put the first effort into it of making that step to do it.